So over the last several weeks, one of the top questions I've received is, what is going on with all these different executive orders? How does that impact the Department of Defense? These different programs that we like to talk about, funding opportunities. How does that impact, a lot of these tech startups? So what we're going to do in this video is break down those five different executive orders that specifically impact the Department of Defense. So I come through the 147 that have happened so far as of the time of this recording so that you don't have to. But before I dive into these five different executive orders and kind of their summaries and then my 2 cents on them, let me just say that I've got a couple thoughts, just high level going into it. So I will say that I'm a bit cynical or skeptical as to what this is actually going to lead to. Again, like I overall think a lot of these are trying to streamline and make government acquisitions more efficient. Huge fan of that. But on the skeptical side, again, it really points back to my personal experience when I was a contracting officer in the Air Force. So I want to hit on a couple of those thoughts first and like why um, this isn't as fast as people think it's going to be, or there's a lot more that has to happen um, down the ranks, down to the actual operators and the folks that are doing the acquisitions, doing the contracting for it to become effective. So first and foremost, like there's still a massive cultural problem which hasn't been addressed. And so I'll tell some stories here in a minute, some actual examples again, from when I was active duty, but there is just no incentive to try new things. And we've seen some stuff with the fork in the road, the early retirements and people getting out, return to office. Like a lot of these different things are having impacts on different contracting, acquisition, finance, career fields. But it's still not addressing this issue that there's just not an incentive to try and move more quickly. And again, something I want to say here is that there are just thousands and thousands of acquisition professionals. So I use that as the umbrella term, contracting acquisition, like program managers, finance. There are thousands of acquisition professionals. And so I'm using some sweeping generalities. And what I want to say is like there are some awesome people in government that are really trying to try new things, push the limits, move things faster so that we can be competitive with Russia and China and Iran, North Korea, all of that. They really understand the mission. They're really trying to make things happen. But there's also a vast majority that are there that are punching the clock and just counting down the days until they can retire. They like the benefits, wherever it might be. And so that to me and what I saw was the vast majority. And here's something else I think many companies, especially if you've been working more in the private sector, coming over to government, what they don't understand. So while we're talking about the Air Force, again, with my experience, the military overall, people often think like, oh, we've got men and women wearing uniforms that are doing this mission. Well, in the acquisition professions, especially in the bigger like program offices, the vast majority of the workforce are civilians. So when I was active duty, I was at Space and Missile Systems Center. That's now under SSC. They've rebranded 4 or 5 times, so who knows what the hell their name is anymore. But point being, there were 3 military members and about 30 civilians in that office. Rough numbers. So just to get a perspective, 3 officers and a vast majority civilians, and a couple of those that were working hard, very motivated, a lot that weren't. So I don't want to totally discount, like there's so many good people that we have the fortune to work with that are really trying to make the mission happen and are focused on that. There's so many, especially in the frozen middle, that are punching the clock. And again, there's no incentive to try new things. The other piece about kind of the skepticism as I go through these 5 different executive orders is a lot of times it's, they're forming committees, they're forming FAR councils, things like that, and they want to have plans within 120 to 180 days. So 4 to 6 months out before they even get the initial assessments pushed up to leadership. And then there's got to be memos. And then again, I'll tell some stories there about like what happens at the lower levels where people are executing these contracts. So actually, let me just jump into that now. So when I was still active duty, so this is back in like 2017, I can't tell you the number of times I sat in briefings and mandatory all calls where everyone had to go and sit and listen to the 2-star or the 4-star talk. And I was a captain at the time working on some pretty large source selections under Space and Missile Systems Center. And what the generals were constantly spouting, both then and then after I got out, just like heard the same story for years. It's like, we're going to move fast. We're going to update the regulations. We're going to empower our people. And I can tell you, sitting as a captain in that room, it was honestly insulting because nothing changed for me. Nothing changed for the day to day. Now, there have been some changes in the last 7.5 years where different authorities and like review levels have been raised, giving a little bit more flexibility. But overall, very, very little was actually done, despite the 2 stars and the 4 stars constantly saying this message for years. And then you get a new person in and they've got their own objectives and their talking points that they want to hit. So overall, like just seeing this over and over again where we're going to run fast, but not with scissors, whatever that means. So, Ira, can you tell? I guess a little too cynical skepticism kind of coming out here. So overall, I just didn't see those things actually get implemented down to the level where the day-to-day folks actually doing the mission, doing the contracts, acquisitions, all of that had more authority. Another example is a lot of these executive orders are really tackling changes within trying to streamline acquisitions, remove certain parts from the federal acquisition regulations, FAR. So why I'm so hesitant there, as I'll give you a quick example. Like I've said this before and I'll say it again. It wasn't really the FAR that was getting in my way of trying new things and trying to streamline things as a young contracting officer. What got in the way was middle management, the commanders, the GS-15s, the director levels. That middle piece is where I had a lot of issues. And so one example, so again, there are the federal acquisition regulations, there are the defense supplement, then there's an Air Force supplement, and then Army, all these Navy, other supplements. And then on top of that, under the major commands, MAJCOMs, they had their own policy directives and guidance on top of it. And I worked under 4 or 5 different major commands as a contracting officer, and so saw multiple different flavors of that at the bigger program offices, anywhere from 50 to 100 to 200 pages of additional guidance and policy directives on top of all the FAR, DFARs, AFARs that we already had to deal with. So this story, I got put on a source selection. It was way behind schedule, and leadership wanted to play catch up on it. So I took the actual, it's either mandatory procedures or guidance spelled out black and white, like if this, and this happens, then you can skip this step. And so I went to my GS-15. I said, hey, this is way behind schedule. It says in black and white right here that we can skip this step, and that will save us 3 months. So allow us to catch up a little bit on our schedule. The answer back was, well, we haven't done that before. So that's again where actually getting, especially the frozen middle, to take some chances, to change things, to go away from like, this is how we've always done it, that will still continue to be a major pain point. I don't really see that being addressed, but hopefully with the amount of pressure that leadership can push on down, that we will actually see some changes. Now, again, what I think actually matters quite a bit is appropriations. Money. Where's the money? Show me the money. Where is it going? And so we're still very early on. There's talks of $1 trillion defense budget next year. The specifics, a lot of argument and back and forth there of like, what does that actually mean? What does it look like? Is it part of the budget reconciliation, etc.? So what I think would help move the needle, what I am positive on, is that more funding going to organizations that are trying to push the needle, that are trying to use new authorities like commercial solutions openings, other transactions, OTs, CSOs, and OTs, and things like that. And so sending more money to DIU, I've really loved, again, talking about some great forward-thinking contracting acquisition professionals, those tied to CDAO. CDAO itself, different story, but seeing the acquisition folks set up things like Tradewinds, really unique and different and extremely useful. So, anyways, if we see more and more funding going to these organizations that are already challenging the status quo and are already trying new authorities, that's where I think we can see a ton of impact. And I guess the good news there, take a break from all my cynicism, is that a lot of new funding. I've talked about the second wave of innovation. I think that funding is going to pulling in more non-traditional companies and helping them actually scale and get into programs of record. And that's where we see the most kind of flexibility and forward thinking and trying new things from the acquisition community. So all that to say is that is where I think it really comes down is like, where's the money and where's it going and what type of capabilities are we supporting? Are we dumping it back into the major acquisition programs that are way over budget, way behind schedule, which we'll talk about in a second. So anyways, so that is a place that we will be watching very closely to see what actually comes out through appropriations. There's a lot of talk going on right now, but that's all it is talk until we actually see it black and white and what's been approved. Then we'll do some more videos on that to talk through it. So I know that was a lot to go through before we even get into the executive orders, but I just want to take that time to kind of share the high level, share that, like, what is this actually going to look like? What does it actually take to start seeing some changes in the day-to-day execution? So it's not just as, I think a lot of people that are unfamiliar, haven't worked in the acquisition fields, just don't have an understanding of like how these things actually get implemented. And so industry sees the big exciting headlines and like, oh, this thing is going to happen and look what this executive order says. But the reality of execution is actually something very different and can be very lengthy and is much more complicated than putting on a couple pages that say, hey, we're going to streamline acquisitions and go faster. So with that said, let's hit the 5 different executive orders and give a quick breakdown of what those are. So the first is restoring common sense to federal procurement. The second is ensuring commercial, cost-effective solutions in federal contracts. 3, modernizing defense acquisition and spurring innovation in the defense industrial base. Ooh, mouthful. Number 4 is establishing the U.S. Investment Accelerator. Number 5 is eliminating waste and saving taxpayer dollars by consolidating procurement. So number 1, let's talk about restoring common sense to federal procurement. So within 180 days, so again, there's the timelines I'm talking about, like 180 days from April 15th when this was signed, amend the FAR to include only provisions required by law, by statute. So there's going to be a lot more scrutiny on add-ons from the agency. And then there's like this 4-year rule where it has to be renewed. So it's kind of forcing the reviews every 4 years to say like, hey, is this really needed? Again, if it's not required by statute, there will be more scrutiny on it. So again, 180 days before those initial assessments roll up. Now they are starting the FAR Council and this, that, and the other. They're starting to throw out some initial changes, and so far, again, it's only been a couple weeks, but there's some minor changes that apply to GSA. That's really it so far. But again, like this overall process scheduled, like, hey, 180 days, you got to provide this feedback on what can go, what can stay. Then you got to go through the process of actually changing the FAR. And then there's the giant question, again, based on my experience, of are we going to get folks to actually do things differently? Because just because it's not in the FAR anymore, there's still this sentiment of, well, that's the way we've always done it. Again, my story, I experienced that in many different ways when I was active duty. So that's where my hesitation is, like, it's going to take, a year for a lot of these changes to actually happen to the FAR. And then, like, what's actually going to happen with the workforce? How are we going to retrain them? How are we going to encourage them to take risk? Things like that. Because a lot of these professionals, they've been around 20 or 30 years. So we again, I'm getting on a soapbox a little bit, but we saw this with other transactions as well. Other transactions, amazing, super flexible authority. only a couple paragraphs really governing how to use them. And so what we've seen is contracting officers that have been around 20 or 30 years being given agreements authority, and you get other transactions that look exactly like the FAR-based contract, like the same. Or one person does a consortium, which is a weird model, and then they don't get in trouble, so then everyone does one. So we'll see, again, what is actually going to change. At least things are being removed so that maybe the new generation of acquisition professionals, or again, those that are already trying to challenge the status quo, have more flexibility there. All right, number 2, ensuring commercial cost-effective solutions in federal contracts. So this one's kicked off an immediate review of upcoming solicitations. So purchases that are already in process, and seeing if they can use commercially available solutions rather than basically custom non-commercial solutions. So that's been kicked off. And what I do like about this executive order is, again, there's a lot of asterisks here, but there's documentation requirements for commercial items in the past. This is now adding this requirement to document why commercial isn't available. So it's changing around kind of the scrutiny and the paperwork process, so that if there is not if you're not buying commercial, now you got to write a bunch of justification and get that scrutiny from leadership and other folks, legal and things like that, to review, is that true? Are there actually commercial solutions that we can use that are going to be faster and more readily available, cheaper, because they're not super duper custom and all this stuff? So very interested to see how this one plays out. And again, like what gets rolled into the FAR and how that changes, again, how the acquisition professionals do their job. So next one, number 3, modernizing defense acquisitions and spurring innovation in the defense industrial base. So again, this is 120 days to propose a plan from basically the different component acquisition executives, 180 days to review the Joint Capabilities Integration Development System, JCIDS. And then this is where I think some headlines came out, major programs that are behind schedule and over budget are up for cancellation. So again, I am very interested. I see all kinds of programs that are billions and billions. Like they've added 70% to like a $50 billion, $70 billion program. They're a couple years into a 10-year project, and they're adding 70% more in a couple years to the timeline. These major acquisitions are really broken. Now, not all of them. I mean, there's fighters and nuclear assets and all kinds of like new bombers and all kinds of crazy, vitally important capabilities that are on these major acquisitions. So the question is, okay, if this massive airframe is way behind schedule, like you can't just go buy a new generation fighter jet bomber in the commercial market. So like what's actually going to happen there? Are they going to cancel it and recompete it and start over? But so there's a lot of questions there. Now, obviously, again, I love seeing the scrutiny because, I've seen people over the years complain about like how much money is going into the Small Business Innovation Research Program, or these funds to support bringing in tech startups. And yeah, there are a lot of issues. Again, we're trying to address many of them of like actually transitioning that technology. They're making a lot of bets. Many of them don't pan out. I mean, that's just kind of how it goes when you're in the new technology, new tech startup world. But anyways, people kind of throwing crap over the fence saying, oh, look at that. But I mean, the SBIR program, a couple $1 billion, again, like we've seen one program add it's like 60 to 80 billion dollars after a couple of years. Like it just does not compare to all these massive major acquisition programs, and they're all a mess and cost reimbursable, and like there's just no incentive from the prime to be on schedule. And anyways, so we'll get too much into that. So all I'd say is there's going to be some more scrutiny. They're going to start reviewing JCIDS and some of these other major acquisition processes. So hopefully, 6 months from now, we'll see the review be completed, and then maybe some reforms will start happening from there. So something to watch, and especially the more immediate effect of like, hey, are they actually going to start canceling some of these major programs? What is that actually going to look like? All right, number 4, establishing the U.S. Investment Accelerator. So the overall goal is to attract more domestic and foreign investment. Um, this does fall under the Department of Commerce and is focused on accelerating investments over $1 billion. So again, being outside of the Department of Defense, um, not a whole lot for me to weigh in here. It seems interesting. Kind of as you read the actual executive order, what it's doing is it seems like essentially establishing an office where when you're doing these over $1 billion investments, then people are going to help you reduce regulations and red tape and get through the process faster. So we'll see. We'll see how that actually gets implemented. And finally, eliminating waste and saving taxpayer dollars by consolidating procurement. So this is really focused on GSA, buying common goods and services. And kind of the main piece I took away from reading through this executive order is that they will be the executive agent for all IT contracts. So with this, one thing I'm worried about is what we've seen. Like one of the biggest agencies that's really been impacted, especially by the return to office, was GSA. They had really been growing and leveraging a lot of the remote work, and a lot of people were enjoying that benefit. And with the return to office policy, again, have seen a huge impact there. Not too much on the Department of Defense side. There were a few organizations that were doing the remote work policies and hiring, but GSA, at least with all of the programs that we're working with and the partners that we work with, it had a really massive impact because again they're spread all over and they're really condensing where their office space is going to be. So, and then the question is, are they going to be allowed to then go and hire? What does that look like? What kind of staffing? So it's a very weird time to say, hey, GSA, we just gutted you, but now you're going to be in charge of all these common goods and services contracts, and we want you to be the lead on all IT contracts as well. GSA has done some really amazing things. I know on the industry side, a lot of issues and pain points with things like OASIS, that's for ANAS type services, assistance and advisory services, CETA contracts, forget that acronym. But basically, on the contracting office side, when I got to use that contract, amazing. Actually flexible. I could do whatever we wanted. On the Air Force side, when I was working IT contracts through NetSense back in the day, horrible, awful, horrendous. Just totally confusing and complex ordering procedures. So it really depends on how GSA goes about setting up these contract vehicles. If it's stuff like OASIS on the contracting side, a lot of flexibility. People can move fast. A lot of different pools of different vendors that you can use. So there could be some really interesting upside here. It just depends on, hey, can they rebuild the GSA workforce and get those acquisition professionals to be able to carry on these responsibilities coming from this executive order. So overall, again, I know it's a lot. I know I spent a lot of time up front before going through the actual executive orders. I just wanted to paint the picture. Like a lot of people, again, see that, oh, this executive order came out, like everything's going to change. No, it takes time. It takes, again, 6 months just to run a lot of these studies and recommendations before it would ever start actually being implemented. And then we talk through a lot of the issues and the culture and the workforce to actually then execute on the new authorities and like what that looks like. So overall, again, I'm happy to see that there is a massive push and effort to streamline the acquisition process, remove a lot of the red tape. But I'd love to see more personally on how's that going to be implemented into the workforce. Are they changing things like defense